Good morning, everyone. Just ask you to get comfortable. Welcome to our 2019 EDST Research Day. I'm delighted that the weather I ordered showed up in time. Not for the weekend, though, unfortunately. Yeah. On behalf of the entire department, I'm honored in a moment to ask Marnie Point to give us to start our research day in a good way with an acknowledgement of the land. I asked Marnie for a bit of a bio, and I appreciate this bio very much, so I'm going to stick close to it. Marnie Point is from the Musqueam Band of the Coast Salish people in this West Point Grey area of Vancouver. Marnie completed both her degrees, a Bachelor of Education and a Master's of Educational Technology at UBC. And she'll be starting her doctoral studies in LLED in the fall. Way to go, Marnie. And Marnie was also a student in one of my teacher education classes years ago. Not too bad. Marnie is also the urban program coordinator and instructor with NITEP, which is UBC's Indigenous teacher education program. She's an instructor with the First Nations Endangered Language Program, where she teaches intermediate level of the language of the Coast Salish, which is Hunkaminam, and I'm not going to go there with my pronunciation. I hope to get better. Marnie comes from a long line of fisher people, and she too is an avid fisherwoman. She owns her own 18-foot gill netter, as both her dad and grandfather always did. She harvests sockeye from the Fraser River each summer, and through this cultural activity, she's able to share the stories and the traditional ways and pass them on to her own children, which connects them with their traditional language and the ways of her people. So I ask Marnie to join me here.
Hasiam Nasiaya, Siatala, Ait Tanishqualoan Quansi Quatsnala, Siel Tanawel, Anthamoni, Talitzin At Homasquimas, Nitzin Ami Quathuilam, Ia Ti, Shkomasquiam Ash, Tamuch, E Hunk Aminam Kan, Huamuch. Thank you all. I'm glad to be here today. I'm welcoming you to the Musqueam territory, the unceded traditional territory of our Hunkaminam speaking people. And it's Hunkaminam. We all have the glottals there, or else we're speaking a different dialect, which is another story. I was just reading, and I want to raise my hands and thank you all for your studies and your research and your good work. And I just want to challenge you today as you're thinking of culture and social justice, and maybe even injustices and the anti-racism, that you think of the indigenous people of the territory you're sitting on and the displacement, the dislocation through the educational system of Indian residential schools and contact. And we even lost our traditional ways of transmission of knowledge learning, our ways of our language, and our communication. And that'll be my studies is the apprenticeship model that we once had and the nonverbal communication that happened within the transmission of learning and teaching and guiding of our people. But I just want to raise my hands to you for your work and welcome you again on this beautiful day that Mona gave to us, to the traditional territory, the unceded traditional territory of our Hunkaminam speaking people. And my name is Marnie Point, and Uncle Larry always says we're supposed to say that we dwelt time immemorial on this delta, and my name is Point because we were the people of the Point. We have a traditional village, but we had a group of people that watched the waterways here, and that was my family. And then we would do the running. I don't know if you've ever seen that run through Musqueam. From here, the bluff, to the Musqueam village to say that there is either danger coming or something coming through the waterways. So we have been on this territory for thousands of years, and if Uncle Larry was here, he would tell you how far and how wide that we all were, but I'll leave that to him.
Thank you very much, Marnie. I just want to say a few words of welcome. I'm Mona Gleason, head of the Department of Educational Studies. And it strikes me as we go deeply into our self-study work that Research Day is one of the few times that we come together for longer than a few hours to share our scholarly work as a community. This is across program areas, across degree paths, across disciplinary, methodological, theoretical interests. So for me, Research Day represents the very best of departmental solidarity. It's a space of what I think of as supportive risk-taking, knowledge exchange, teaching and learning. And amidst all the busyness in our lives, particularly at this time, and every time I speak to someone, I feel I should stop saying how busy I am because, as if everyone else isn't busy. Research Day is a chance for us to just really be reminded about why we're here. So this day in particular really belongs to our students. So thanks to each of you in the room for being here, for your work, for opening up spaces of engagement, for enabling all of us to practice being together. And also thank you to Dr. Azam Sensoy for presenting our keynote in a little bit. We're really looking forward to that. I also want to thank in particular our grad advisor, Allison Taylor, who continues to work very diligently and hard to support the department and particularly the graduate students. I know that Allison will have more to say particularly about our excellent GAAs. I want to also acknowledge all of the staff who in one way or another contribute to these kind of events, contribute to this kind of day. I'd like to acknowledge in particular Alex, who's with us in the room, Sharmila, Alliance, who have ensured that the details that we really rely on are looked after. So let's take our cue from Marnie's acknowledgement. We are privileged to work on Musqueam territory, and we're privileged to belong to this community of scholars. So embrace these opportunities and enjoy the day. So thank you.
Thanks, Mona. I think, and welcome everyone. It's great to see people coming out, and I, as Mona said, the planning for this activity, as you're probably aware, happens long before. And I just want to really thank our graduate assistants who not only do a lot of work during the term in terms of trying to advocate for students, they are excellent, and they also are planning activities. They're constantly asking students what they think they, what they need, and trying to find people who will help support. And so I think that role, I've said this before, I said it last year, in the department, not every department has that kind of role, but I think it's key. And I think our grad assistants do an excellent job. I also want to say that these positions come up, and if you are a grad student coming in and are thinking that you'd like to contribute to the department in any way, it's an excellent opportunity, I think, to learn more about the department and to learn more about what's going on with other students. So I want to, I have multiple cards, and I want to just give them to our GAAs as an expression of thanks. So, but hopefully everyone is here. I know Naila is here, and Maria Angelica, is she in the room? Okay, excellent. And Lena is sitting beside her, and Mary. Is Mary here? Okay, but I'll give you these after. But I want to just, again, appreciate what you've done. They have also asked a few other students to help, and so the people who are giving you name tags and so on have been actively involved as well, and those are Francine Emmons. Is Francine, I think, is still there? And also Jessica Lucier, and then Alejandro is not able to be here, but I want to just, again, take a moment to thank them. And if I can put this down, I will start clapping and hopefully... So we have an excellent program. Of course, the day wouldn't happen if people weren't willing to come and talk about their research. And so thank you all for being so active, for helping to put sessions together. Some of the faculty did that too in terms of the areas. We put out a call, a challenge almost, for areas to think about what's going on and cutting edge kind of work in their areas. And some of those folks are presenting too. And so after this day, we will have lots of, I hope, stimulating discussion. And then at the end of the day, we will, the GAAs are inviting people to come to Kerner Pub from 5 until 7 to, or I think after the last session, so it might be a little bit after 5. So we welcome you there. Now, I wanted to say that this year we have a keynote, and we're very grateful to Özlem Sensoy for coming. And Neela the GAAs had not only, well, they had everything to do with the program and also inviting the speaker. So I would like to ask Neela to come and introduce our speaker.
It's a great pleasure to have Dr. Özlem Sensoy with us today. I know most of us, we know who is Dr. Özlem Sensoy, but just as, the routine of introducing our guests, Dr. Özlem Sensoy is an associate professor in the Faculty of Education, the associate director of the Center for Education, Law and Society, an associate member of the Department of Gender, Sexuality and Women's Studies, and an affiliated faculty member of the Center for Comparative Muslim Studies at Simon Fraser University. So she teaches courses on social justice education, critical community literacy, and popular culture and multicultural anti-racism theories. Her research has been published in journals including Radical Pedagogy, Harvard Educational Review, Gender Education, Race, Ethnicity, and Education. So she's the co-author with Ro and D'Angelo of the award-winning introductory text to social justice education. I engage my teacher education program students to read this book. Which is extremely helpful for the basics of what we call social education, social justice education. So the book is Everyone Really Equal? An Introduction to Begin is actually social justice education. And it was published by Teachers College Press, 2017, 2000, so it has been in the 5th edition, I think, twice. And there is, it's translated into different languages.
Korean.
Yeah.
Yes.
So would like to welcome Dr. Özlem Sensoy. Thank you.
Thank you, Neela. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here as a visitor on the beautiful Musqueam lands. I always love having an invitation to come out to UBC and seeing the new campus, because every time I'm here it feels like a new campus and I have to reorient myself to which buildings are where. So the organizing committee, thank you, and everyone who's here today for Research Day. It's really a pleasure to be with you all and talk to you about some of my sort of new thinking around social justice education. And I've been trying to capture what this new thinking could be, how it could be represented in metaphors, and I like to, those who've heard me speak before might know that I like to use metaphors to capture complex ideas. And the IKEA car, I saw this image online, seemed like a useful metaphor for thinking about social justice in a new way. So this is what I'm going to talk about is the old way. Maybe it'll be the old way, I'm hoping. But first, let me set the landscape and then talk a little bit about how I've been trying to push my own thinking around what social justice education and practice might look like, which is, I think, an issue that many of you are also care about. So, setting the context for education. So on the one hand, we're dealing with the Ministry of Education and related commitments to what schooling and education ought to be. So this is the mandate of the BC Ministry of Education. The purpose of the BC school system is to enable the approximately 630,000 students enrolled each school year to develop their individual potential and to acquire the knowledge, skills, and abilities needed to contribute to a healthy society and a prosperous and sustainable economy. So those are the commitments and the mandate that all districts and teachers commit to and have to uphold. And it would be difficult to not see similar kinds of commitments reflected in the post-secondary higher education kind of setting. Actualizing individual potential, increasing skills and knowledge and abilities, as well as contributing to a prosperous or healthy, sustainable economy. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, we also have critiques and analysis of the system. What does it take to achieve individual potential and, in turn, a healthy society in a context in which there is a great deal of evidence that that will be challenged? And the system itself will not give you, as Charlie Brown so aptly captures, the system itself will not give you the tools necessary to dismantle it. This is reflected in a lot of social justice-oriented scholarship, including the words of Frederick Douglass from 1857, which I really appreciate. This is from a talk that he gave, in which a speech that he gave, in which he said, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did and it never will." Meaning that the citizens of a community in which there is evidence of social injustice, in order to change that state of being, must be prepared to push against the structures of power and to demand justice in some way, so to press from above. So we have this this tension that I think is developing. So the ministry and educational organizations are committed to helping young people develop their individual potential, contribute to a healthy society, and a prosperous economy. Well, on the other hand, we have academic evidence and scholarly research that says to us that the power structures within which this schooling occurs need to be pushed back against to some extent. Adding on to this really challenging terrain, we have scholarly evidence that shows, in the context of Indigenous education in this setting, that 4 out of 10 on-reserve Indigenous youth complete grade 12, and depending on what part of the country we're talking about and which communities, urban or rural, or rural youth, these numbers shift slightly. That's compared to 9 out of 10 non-Indigenous youth. Aboriginal peoples are younger than the rest of the population, meaning there is a greater population of young Indigenous youth in school settings, nearly 50% under age 25, compared to 30% of the non-Indigenous population, and 33% below the age of 15, so in the K-12 system. I don't know if anyone has seen the 2015 survey conducted by the Canadian Teachers Federation. This is from the summary report. The full report is available PDF'd on their website if you're curious. This survey was done with teachers across the country on their perspectives on Aboriginal education in public schools in Canada. And they surveyed close to 2,000 teachers, and the findings are very compelling, I think. In part, on the topic of resources, these teachers were asked questions: how sufficient are resources? How sufficient is funding, training on Aboriginal education? And the overwhelming majority of teachers said that all of these resources were insufficient. In terms of professional development, the same survey, they were asked, how have you participated and how much have you participated in professional development related to Aboriginal education? 48%, nearly half of the teachers, said they had not participated in any professional development related to Aboriginal education. Adding on, so that's the, between the tension, there's the context and setting in which we have a large number of Indigenous youth in the public school system and experiencing ongoing marginalization and disenfranchisement by the system. Adding on, 2018 recent report from the Canadian Bureau of International Education. BC, so this is from, they looked at data from 2016 and 2017. In 2017, nearly 500,000 international students in Canada at all levels of study. And this is an increase of 34% between 2014 and 2017. BC is second to Ontario for the percentage of these students that we host. So about 48% of these international students are in Ontario, and about a quarter, 24%, are in BC. And Vancouver is second only to Toronto as the largest metropolitan area where these international students are studying. So left to right is Toronto first, then Vancouver, and the gray bar is 2016 and the blue bar is 2017 statistics. And you can see how the numbers are increasing, and Vancouver is second, or the Lower Mainland, pardon me, is second. And in terms of the source nations, where these students are coming from, the top 3 source nations are China, India, and South Korea, 1, 2, 3 from left to right, again showing an increasing trend. And so we now have, on top of the history of colonization and the experiences of young, school-aged Indigenous youth in public schools, we have a large population of international students and the cultural and linguistic diversity that they bring also in the school setting. We haven't really talked yet about the context of educators. The large gap, many of you who've been working in teacher education will know the statistics between the gap between and the widening gap between the demographics of teachers and the students in their classroom. And I'm going to add on to the racial gap between predominantly white, middle-class teaching population and administrative population and the students in their schools. There is the landscape of increased corporatization in schools. This is Surrey, the Bell secondary. Someone remind me. The Surrey. They've got a complicated name. They've got the Bell Center connected to the. Sorry, say it again. Performance Arts Center. Thank you. So all of the increased corporate activities that schools are needing to engage with, which is a relatively recent phenomenon. Part of these are contracts and ads. You'll see in the table, this is from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives report, the number of COLA contracts. BC is at 28%, across the prairies at 48%. These are marketing arrangements with COLA companies that schools, districts enter into in order to help fund some of their basic programs. So this is textbooks and equipment for the classrooms, basic things, not extra things. There are also sale of service commitments. So 21% of schools in the Atlantic region, 10% of schools in BC engage in other kinds of service activities. This is renting spaces in order to fund, again, school activities. And from a teacher who had a student in, who had moved his child from a school in Winnipeg, in an urban center in Winnipeg, to a more rural environment. And in part, he wrote, "I'm very distressed at seeing the corporate agenda enter into the public school environment. My daughter, who went to school in Winnipeg, where there was a McDonald's 50 yards from the front entrance and the school, and there were 5 Coke machines in the hallways. If you were to walk down the hallways of, I don't know about UBC, but at SFU, the landscape of corporate involvement and activities in public school settings have become normalized in a setting in which many scholars have argued that they need to be problematized. So when the public space is infringed upon by corporate activities, it's another layer of critique, analysis, if nothing else, acknowledgement and understanding that needs to happen in the school setting. I'm going to add 2 more things to this complex IKEA, I'm sort of laying out the pieces of the IKEA car in case it's not too obvious, and trying to do it in a sort of succinct way, because I think many of us are familiar with these pieces that are there and needing our attention. One of the things that I'm very interested in is the media literacy context, in which in the social the social lives of young people that have become so saturated with media and pop culture content and context. And the increased need for media literacy. These are the top 30 most visited websites in the world, and you'll you'll recognize a lot of these multinational corporations like Google and YouTube and Facebook, which are 1, 2, and 3, and they fall into the following main categories. So the majority of them are search engines, next social networking sites like Reddit, a lot of international, so Instagram, Reddit, but international social networking sites as well, there's a Russian one that I didn't recognize and had to look up. Yeah, thank you. Of course, porn sites, which are probably not surprising since a lot of the activity of anyone who's read a little bit about this topic will know that a lot of the activity of porn sites are to engage younger users by tricking them into early exposure. And by tricking them, I mean having their, so using keywords like Pokemon or things that kids might look up, help to return some of the content from their websites. And of course, some shopping, encyclopedic, and other news media and software sites. So these are the top 30 sites, and the pattern is pretty significant. So any educators who care about this social media landscape and both the activities that are happening in that presumed democratic space, and by presumed democratic I mean a space that seems accessible to anyone who's able to get online, and yet that's also saturated with corporate activity. So these corporations have profit interests that are not simply about making information accessible, which can also be there, but someone needs to sift through the billion returns that you get, that Google has returned for you, we should say. So again, the media context, it's hard. I do a lot of my research in upper elementary kinds of settings and secondary school settings, and I have not in the past, since 2012 probably, walked into a like grade 5, 6 split kind of classroom where every kid has a smartphone in their pocket, and of course the technology in their pockets is way ahead of the technology in the school in terms of the equipment, the computers and other tools that the teachers and staff have access to. On top of all this are the escalating anxieties of families and parents that these are the kinds of things that I've heard, and I'm sure they're familiar to you. Teachers saying, or student teachers saying, parents in my district are so conservative, I can't get away with teaching LGBTQ issues. My administration keeps saying politics has no place in the school. I don't want to be accused of pushing my values onto students. I know that racism and poverty and homophobia are important issues, but I'm a new teacher. I can barely keep up. I get that there are problems, but I don't know where to start or how to start. Right? The additive approach to more and more content being a part of an expanding binder of things that the school and educators have to contend with mean at least the following. So these are the pieces that I've laid out for now, and I'm sure I know there's a lot more that we could add to this list. We're juggling the provincial mandate, the academic evidence that institutional structures reinforce the forces of oppression, the ongoing disenfranchisement of Indigenous students from schooling, insufficient resources for teachers to integrate, a willful ignorance or an avoidance of professional development activities to develop teacher knowledge, the context for other racialized families, Black, Indigenous, and other families of color, people of color, students and teachers and administrators who are often working in isolation in settings where they might be trying to do some social justice work, but often do so unsupported or with limited resources. The internationalization of schooling and higher ed and the increased dependence of schools on the funds that are brought into the system because of it. The linguistic and ethnic diversity and globalization tensions that are brought into the school settings. Entrepreneurialism and the corporate and market-driven activities of schools. Information and media literacy needs and the pressures of the web, as well as the opportunities that often go untapped around citizen reporting and other Web 2.0 technologies, the social isolation, cyberbullying and cybersecurity issues, parental family needs, anxiety in the political context, the isms and Islamophobia, among many others. And the result, I think, is a bit of a fire hose of social issues and political priorities that need to be that all have urgency and need to be addressed. This is some thoughts from Dr. John Young in Education Canada from 2004 that I still think are really valuable and capture the magnitude of the work that needs to happen in a school setting. He writes in part in Education Canada this piece, "Today the increased recognition of Canadian cultural diversity and the uncertainties associated with technology and a changing global economy serve only to add to the ambiguity associated with this agenda, the mandate agenda, yet this is the task of schools. This is the ever-increasing amount of stuff that schools and educators and the workers inside of those buildings need to manage." As a result of this fire hose, social justice education, so folks committed to dismantling or at least challenging those institutional structures, can often look like this IKEA car metaphor, which is a way to capture the idea of managing volume. And so you have a lot of resistance to managing more and more volume. I don't need more things on my plate. The school is not a place for politics, are all code for this inability to manage volume, and it's a very real and true concern. But social justice education practice can also often look like the chocolate runway. And I hear some giggling, so I assume some of you at least recognize that this is Lucy and Ethel working at the chocolate factory, where they decided one day they needed to become independent from their spouses and get jobs. And they kind of underestimated the task ahead of them. And what seemed like a simple thing at the start, they were responsible for wrapping the chocolates that were coming down the runway, quickly turns into something that's much more challenging to manage. And managing the volume and managing the urgency seem to be necessary at the same time. So a lot of things that Lucy and Ethel did here were problematic. So they not only underestimated the task, but they also assumed that loving the topic equaled having the skills. And those of us who might have personal commitments to social justice might not necessarily have the skill building resources or abilities in order to enact socially just work in learning environments. So as fun as they are, I'm going to move on and say, okay, so then what? So if this volume and urgency thing, Özlem, you're asking us to rethink that, so how will we think about it differently? So I'm sort of advocating, I'm going to use strong language, but I'm not 100% sure. So I'm willing to, I would love to think with you about what this might look like. So I'm advocating for a shift in our thinking about socially just teaching away from content. So what would ideal lesson plans and lessons and materials look like? Away from an attitude, sort of good people versus bad people, racist things and anti-racist things. And away from a belief system in which we try to convince students, for example, through classroom activities, and I did a lot of these as myself, classroom activities like 1 step forward and 2 steps back, and there are lots of these social justice activities that a lot of us do in the classroom, and they're really intended to shift our thinking and empathy with injustice. And instead of these things, that we shift our social justice practice activities to doing social justice as a lens of inquiry for understanding how society works, as a scholarly evidence-based discipline, not a feeling, not a slogan, not about political correctness, but as an approach, as a strategy to address structural inequities in our environment. Let me try to demonstrate what I think this might look like. So, this is the outside of a grocery store. PCC Markets in Seattle, if any of you know. If I were to ask you as a group of community people who live in this community where we have grocery stores, what kinds of things you might expect to find outside the grocery store. Just by virtue of living our lives and going through routine activities in this environment, I think many of us could generate a list. So we could say there are shopping carts outside the grocery store, a place to park cars, signage, community signage. There might be seating where people are having a snack. Those kinds of things I would expect to see outside the grocery store, and I don't think I would have too much debate about whether or not those were true facts at most grocery stores. There could be anomalies, but I'm guessing that I could get all of us to agree that those would not be anomalies at a grocery store on the outside. And on the inside, I could ask you, what do you expect to see on the inside of the grocery store? Checkout lines, people moving their carts around the aisles, dairy section and a produce section, and dry goods in the middle, and a place to pay and pack what you buy. Again, just by virtue of being in that environment, we can probably agree to some list that we generate, that most grocery stores would have those pieces inside the store. But what happens when we use a specialized lens? And this is where I'm thinking of the social justice practice work. So if I were to say, let's use a specialized lens to look at the same space, and if it was an engineering lens, someone with that lens and those skills might be focused on different things or additional things in that space. Things like structural supports, the types of lighting and refrigeration, the location of exits and sprinkler systems, and so on. If I were to look at that same space using a nutrition lens and the expertise that that brings after study, I might be focused on things like the quality of the food, the calorie and fat profile, whether or not the fruit and vegetables is fresh and to what extent, how perishable foods are stored, and so on. Again, a marketing lens, looking in the same space, could give me different skills with which to look. How much time shoppers are spending in various parts of the aisle, how foods are positioned in the various spaces and shelves, and what items are placed where, could all be things that someone with a specialized marketing lens would see as a course of habit from deep study on that topic. And what about a social justice lens? So if I were to study, develop, learn, and apply a social justice lens to that space, again, I might be able to focus in on different things. The location of the store in relation to the neighborhood, issues around accessibility, is there public transportation nearby? Are the products affordable in relation to the average income in the neighborhood? Who is assigned to what type of work in the space? How are employees treated in terms of pay scale and work conditions? Is there a union? And other kinds of questions. And I'll just apologize for the shift in font. The PowerPoint has made the move from a Mac to a PC. So the last, how are employees treated, pay range, schedule flexibility, health insurance, working conditions, and unionization are all the kinds of issues that someone with a specialized focus could bring to that analysis. So maybe there's a different kind of a metaphor, social justice education as a practice, not as a belief system, and what might that look like? So I think if I were to present to you the rules of a game like basketball, someone who is a novice player can still pick up the ball and play, despite not perhaps having the skills of an expert player. And yet, all the pieces don't need to be in place to get going. That's the challenge with the volume metaphor. We often feel like all the pieces in the IKEA car need to be in place. In fact, they do need to be in place before you can get moving at all. But with something like a metaphor like basketball, as one that I've been thinking about, a novice player can still do a lot. They have to learn the basics, the rules of the game, as it were. You can't just pick up the ball and walk around the room, right? There are some rules of the game. There are some historical, political, and social context that needs to be understood. This is from my own sort of work in trying to understand the issues related not simply to reconciliation, but truth. Truth is first, right? We need to understand the basics of historical facts that have occurred. We can consider different interpretation of the facts in evidence, but that doesn't mean you can just, any scenario of things is the same as the facts that have been brought to bear. Good morning. So despite not having all the skills of a Michael Jordan, a novice player can still learn the rules of the game, do drills, watch skilled players, and practice themselves, right? But a skilled player will bring other talents to the game. Someone like Michael Jordan probably doesn't make the same moves twice. They think about the context in which their moves are happening, who else is on the playing field to support them, what his own, how he might be feeling on any particular day in a game, and not resting on the laurels of being good at what he does. And let me give you a few more sort of specific things around what someone who might be thinking about social justice as practice rather than as content might be able to do. Thinking in terms of structures and patterns, not simply individual incidences or individual people. So an individual in the context of other players and other actors. Assuming a stance of humility as a lifelong learner whose moves will shift and develop as one gains more knowledge and skills. Understanding that how we respond, our actions, our practices, comes from how we see and understand the world. So perspectives, theory, and consciousness. I often, and I'm sure that you've also experienced this if you've worked with teacher education students or student teachers or novice educators who are just starting, will feel frustrated with a focus on theory. Like, well, tell me what to do. Why are you telling me about theory so much? Because the connection isn't always made. We don't always bridge to the understanding that how we think about the world, the theories that we're able to identify and contextualize really do influence how we act in the world. And that's an important linkage to be making continuously. To recognize that we are social beings always in contextual and dynamic relation to one another, so my moves will not be the same in any two settings. Something that worked in one school with one family in one community might not work in other places. Consult widely to not simply guide a response, but to shape your understanding of the problem, as well as the systems that are in place beyond the immediate. Consider not only personal dispositions, but also skill level. I think this is often, especially in administrative contexts, when we're trying to form a committee, for instance, to address an issue of inequity. We might consider that, like international education, we might say if you've had lots of international travels and you really love meeting new people, that could be a wonderful personal disposition, but it might not necessarily be the skills you need to address the globalization and international students' experiences in your district or in your school. And construct rest stops on the highway. Where are the opportunities to ask for help and strategies to respond to midstream problems? Lucy and Ethel didn't really have a pause button. The system hadn't really built in a way for them to ask for help and to correct the challenge that they were facing until it got extremely out of hand. So, what might this look like practically? How might one work with the concept of social justice as a lens of inquiry rather than a set of values and beliefs? I want to, just in this last part, go through, identify 5 pretty well-established concepts, social justice concepts, and see if we can translate them into social justice practices that don't really require us to believe in things happening or believe that sexism exists, for instance, in order to act in ways that are that further a more just social context for everyone. First concept, There's no neutral ground and no blank slate. This is a rather well-established principle in social justice practice. Bev Tatum, Desmond Tutu, Howard Zinn are some of the foundational names that we all know. You can't be neutral on a moving train. As Bev Tatum wrote, when people do not disrupt unfair systems of privilege, they are willingly or unwillingly on the moving sidewalk. That the default state is not neutral, that the default state is the ongoing perpetuation of existing injustices. So that's the first concept, that there's no neutral classroom space. I know many of you have read Megan Bowler's work on democratic space, and that doesn't necessarily mean a blank space, an empty space into which all students are coming in freely and are able to participate in freely and fully. Concept 2, identity is the interplay between your individuality and your social group membership. This is also rather well established. So I was born Özlem Şensoy, and in 1972, had I been born 100 years earlier, in 1872, my name would have been written in a different script. When my family immigrated to Canada, the diacritical marks above and below my first and surnames were removed, as was then the pronunciation of my name. I was Ms. Özlem Şensoy for a great deal of my youth and university life. I became Dr. Özlem Şensoy in 2004 and Professor Özlem Şensoy in 2006. And so the simple speech act of my name, as well as the writing of my name, as well as the professional affiliations associated with my name, were all part of social group identities that have little to do with me. So for example, if someone were to get on the radio and say, we are looking for Özlem, I would know that they are looking for me possibly, but the cops could get on the radio and say, we're looking for a white woman, and that could also be me. So our names are sort of the great carriers of this. So the linguistic communities we belong to, the gender communities we belong to, the family communities, the professional communities are often carried in our names. These naming practices and patterns, the linguistic, cultural, ethnic patterns, change with history, immigration, and interaction with institutional immigration structures, as well as professional advancement as just a few examples of those. So your identity is this interplay between your individual experiences and the social groups that you belong to, which are also playing out in your environment for you. Concept 3, identity is shaped both internally, how I feel and identify, as well as externally, how I'm identified by others. I don't know if any of you have seen this meme. I really, really love it because I love kitty cats. So this is a meme that was circulating some time ago. You may have seen it, little kitten looking in the mirror and seeing a lion. The idea behind it is to have confidence in yourself, see that inner lion in yourself, even if no one will see it in you. And that's what this little kitty cat is doing, looking in the mirror and sees a big lion. But if this little kitty cat were to walk into the room, how would we respond to him? And I know it's a him, by the way, because I learned from the SPCA that orange tabbies are almost always, like over 99% male. It's a genetic thing. Interesting, right? I didn't know that. But if the kitty cat walked into the room, how would we respond? Oh, there's a little kitty cat. Would we respond to that cat like the lion that he sees himself as? Probably not. Probably not. And what in turn would this do to that kitty cat, right? You are not seeing how I see myself. And yet my experience is also shaped by the fact that I'm not threatening in this, I'm seen as not threatening in this environment. I'll give you a quick example from my own experience. I was born in the Middle East, in Istanbul, and into a secular Muslim family. when I cross the border, my experience is not that of how I might identify as a Middle Eastern Muslim woman. Because the way that I am identified by the guards at the border is a white lady crossing the border, right? So my experiences are shaped by this interplay between how I identify internally and how I'm identified by others in society who make assumptions about me based on what they see and what they think they know about that group of people. Concept 3, so shaped both internally and externally. Concept 4, who I am is a product of home socialization along with messages in society about people like me. So without anyone ever telling 4 or 5-year-old kids to draw a picture of a family, your family, and what that picture should look like, there are all kinds of ways in which the ideas around what the acceptable drawing looks like are communicated to children, so that the nuclear family is always in a suburban place. There's often a mom, a dad, and smiling children. We're in a suburban space. It's a Mona Gleason day. No pavement, no concrete, and no extended family. These are common ways in which children represent, of course, not all children, but all of us receive the social messages about what looks right and appropriate with what else. So this socialization, or the systemic training into the norms of our culture, occurs via the family and is transmitted in schools, but also via popular culture. So if I were to describe, do you know who this is? This is Cookie Monster, in case you didn't know. If I were to describe Cookie Monster as blue, as a messy eater, as large, as having a deep voice, would you agree that that's a fair description of Cookie Monster? Not the only way, but those are some of the ways that we could describe Cookie Monster. But we also attribute a gender to Cookie Monster without other evidence other than blue, messy eater, and what others are also doing, calling him Cookie Monster he. What if Cookie Monster were pink, a neat eater, small compared to others around him, and had a high voice? Again, without anyone, this is part of the process of how media socialize children into what goes with what. And these patterns are important because they're part of this systemic training into the norms of one's culture, whether you believe in it or not. So this is where we get to discourse. Whether we believe in it or not, we all learn these rules of classification of the people we encounter, which ideas which belong to which bodies. So if I were to say to a group of undergrad students, is this image masculine or feminine? And I'm aware that I'm only giving you 2 options. What do you think my students would say? What do you think they do say? Because we do this activity in class. And you can too. I think these are really valuable in talking about discourses, and whether you believe them or not does not really impact their wide circulation and consistency. So my students say masculine. Probably not surprising. Masculine or feminine? Masculine. Then we look at this one. Often side by side, masculine or feminine? They usually say less masculine than the other guy, than him. Why? And this is where discourses in their complexity become apparent. They're both young men, hairless chests. I should have put these side by side. But the fact that he has his neck exposed and is spraying something they call perfume, all of these little rules start to come into play in how we categorize him. And that's significant, whether you believe in it or not. And we don't just use these rules for people. If I were to say masculine or feminine, and not about who eats what, but there's clearly an image that my students identify as the masculine image in relation to the other. And these ideas change over time. So ideas of masculinity or ideal masculinity from the 1920s or 30s is not the same. So the vocabulary of masculinity is not the same as in the 2000s and 2010s. So key ideas, concepts, these are the 5 concepts, or well-established social justice concepts. There's no neutral ground. Identity is not just about individual me, but the social groups I belong to. Concept 3, identity is also shaped not just internally how I feel, but also externally how people respond to me. 4, our ideas about people are shaped by messages about people who are like me and people who are not like me. These wider, and concept 5, these wider cultural messages, the socialization process, and the rules about what goes with what are communicated to all of us whether we agree with these ideas or not. So, what can we do in the context of social justice practice? I'm sorry, I haven't been looking at my clock. Wrapping it up. In the context of social justice practice, one of the things that we can do is practicing individual as well as group identities, both ourselves as instructors and have our students in any social gathering, practice seeing individual members of the community as well as what groups are there represented and not. There is a fantastic website of resources from an organization called Tools for Change in the Greater Seattle area by the late Margot Adair and Sharon Howell. A lot of those resources are still available. There's great handouts and things that you can use in your own teaching or just to inform, press your thinking around some of these principles that I'm going to be sharing. So they write in one of their sort of workplace materials, they write this, when members of oppressed groups have to choose between individuality and group identity, it's a no-win situation. If a person chooses individuality, it becomes extremely difficult to maintain ties to their own community. They look different but act the same as the rest of the organization. If, on the other hand, they choose to preserve their cultural identity, they can find themselves both isolated in the organization and facing perpetual resistance to their claiming of cultural identity. To overcome tokenism, we need to create organizational cultures, and I would argue school cultures, that enable everyone to claim both their individual and cultural identity simultaneously. The individual and group identification simultaneously. So how can we work with young people to, again, you don't need to buy into any beliefs about equity or social justice in order to work at this individual and group. Who's here? What groups are here? Recognizing each person, but also the group identities that are and are not visible. Something else we can do, excavate hidden ideologies, or at least name them as a struggle. Gayatri Spivak wrote somewhere, I can't remember where she wrote it, but I remember what she said, which is, even if we don't have the answers to challenging social justice problems, we can keep them alive as problems. So keeping the problems alive, keeping the struggle alive is a really active practice. Excavating that piece of the oppressor that's planted inside of us, as Audre Lorde wrote. What are these hidden ideologies that are connected to our discourse? I don't know if you've ever seen these neck strips. Are these barbaric cultural practices? How do we use this terminology in relation to whom and about what products? These are little tape things. You can tape the loose skin at the back of your neck and give yourself a neck lift. I don't know if it'll work with regular tape, but Nexi sells these tapes that you can buy. And it pinches you just go like that. Was his honor wounded if we were watching Beauty and the Beast and all its permutations? Again, excavating the hidden ideologies when we use these terms with certain bodies and not others. Stalking is romantic and charming and sexy. I I don't know if anyone watches Pepe Le Pew anymore, but a lot of my students sure were into 50 Shades of Grey. This is a passage from one of the books. He pulls up outside my duplex. I belatedly realize he's not asked me where I live, yet he knows. What able cell phone tracking, helicopter owning stalker wouldn't? That's really romantic, isn't it? So how we use these ideas. So the discourse of romance, if we were to connect it to an idea really in really concrete ways, the discourse of romance, of charm, changes over time. And it can change to this kind of a vocabulary where things could be interpreted to push yourself onto, as Pepe does, onto Penelope when she is clearly saying no, is one of the ways in which we can excavate how these ideologies are circulating in very neutral ways. Do, there's just a couple more, and then I'll be at the end. This is again from Tools for Change, so don't worry about having to record this. If you go to Tools for Change, they have a printout. I find this useful because, and this is in the context of, again, workplace training that they do. This is something we can all do in classroom settings, become aware of patterns people, students, learn to navigate mainstream spaces. So for example, tendencies of students in privileged positions or people in privileged positions, tendencies of students in oppressed positions. So for example, people in privileged positions often are comfortable talking. People in oppressed positions find it difficult to speak up, timid. They try to please or hold back anger. And if you know these patterns can exist, how can you change the practices of the space to respond constructively rather than to assume that the space is equal and anyone who wants to can just speak up? Or that it's a personal lack of confidence problem, right? Either as the person who's marginalized or as the instructor moderating that space. Do respond to the patterns. There are lots of things that people in privileged positions can do. And so if you're an instructor, how do you shift your practice so that it isn't just about your love of chocolate or your love of the topic to drive your practices, but that there are concrete moves that you can make. So if you were to not guess what's needed, how might you shift the work of the classroom? Asking for feedback, checking in one-on-one. There are lots of, this is where my own attention has really shifted. So away from those, I value all my students, or I want my students to be included, to the actual practices of social justice that can perhaps result in those things in this context, for this time, in this group. But it's a move that I can develop and use and think about implementing in my own classroom. And for my closing metaphor, I leave you with the brick wall cigar. Once you see it, it's hard not to see it. And for anyone who hasn't seen it yet, it's okay. You will. It will come to you. But this can also be a risk, though, because we use this image a lot in my research class to talk about how theory, can you see the cigar? Do you want me to show you? Anyone? So it's in the middle with the ash tip at the very center of the image. But once you see it, it's hard to see anything else when you look at it. So in research, we kind of run into this problem. So if I have a set of ideas about what I expect to find in this space, it can be hard for me to walk into that space and notice something else going on that could be equally interesting. But I think it works here too, in that this is the way that my own thinking has been shifting around social justice education, mostly because I did a lot of those exercises and activities in learning settings that I thought were so powerful for me. And yet for many students, they were just not into it or felt guilted out, that you're making me feel guilty about privilege. And I think that shifting to social justice education as a set of skills that we can develop and build can be a useful shift. At least that's where I stand for now. So, thank you for listening to me. And I love these kinds of research days because they're a wonderfully supportive environment in which to explore your own and your colleagues' recent work. So I appreciate you listening so intently and generously to my own recent thinking on this topic. So thank you.
Hello. Thank you for your talk. I'm over here. Yeah.
Hello.
I have a question about this move from beliefs to skills. My concern is it itself could at least be construed or understood as a neutralizing move. I wonder how you might address the potential objection from, for instance, like a Freudian idea that consciousness raising, conscientização, is sort of the ground zero of social justice, that you really have to speak to the heart, and the heart doesn't listen oftentimes in terms of skills. Oftentimes they do in terms of beliefs. So, for instance, a lot of the things seemed about identity, but not a lot about justice and the moral concerns of justice. And in particular, I would say, even perhaps beyond the moral concerns, the existential concerns that are entailed in these kinds of things. So I wonder how this strategic or perhaps pedagogical move from belief to skills might, at the very same time, however, violate the first principle against neutrality, and in itself be a form of neutrality, in particular, and that it might prevent us from doing the kind of consciousness-raising kind of work that seems also very fundamental to the kind of work.
It's a big question, but I like it. And here's why I like it, because I laid out the problem so this strategic response is a response to a presumed problem, or a problem that I'm identifying as problematic. The volume and the urgency pieces. And these two pieces, the volume of social justice related stuff that people who are in formalized school settings feel like they need to address, and the urgency of those issues. So, whereas the long-term work that you were describing, the moral commitments to sort of fundamentally shifting how social relations are working, is a longer-term sort of parallel path, is how I would think about it. I don't mean to suggest that we abandon the moral commitments, the moral shift in thinking that can shift everything else we do. However, at the same time, I think that there is a place for some practical maneuvering around the 13 weeks we have in class for the one social issues 314 class that all the teacher ed students have to take, that I think can be a space that's more productive and effective even if we shifted the attention of the students, the overwhelming majority of whom, not all of them, but the overwhelming majority of whom have not experienced any deep thinking or space to engage with social justice issues of any type, to deal with the resistance that often comes up for so many of us who teach those kinds of courses. But I'm open to hearing if you have other suggestions of how the justice piece can be brought more fully. I don't know that I agree that it's an abandoning of that, of those commitments. I think it could be maybe another sort of a detour in the path, another road. There are many folks who I know of, I've heard from, who are working in institutional spaces and learning environments in isolation, who have the kinds of commitments that Frerian commitments, and other sort of forms of sort of commitments to decolonization that wish for people to have more skills. So people, the administrators that they interact with, and not necessarily just be spouting the tokenistic sort of moral virtue language that we sometimes associate with leadership. And I can think of, my own university. I'm not calling out anyone here at UBC, but we have a lot of commitments to equity and diversity and inclusion, and all of those things sound incredible, and yet they often ring hollow when the practices don't really match up to what those ideals are. So I hope I'm not sliding out from under the question, because I think it's really incredibly important. But I still think I would argue there's still a place for these kinds of strategic rethinking and attention in our own teaching work, especially with teacher-ed students, but not just with them. I see another question. Good morning.
I'm kind of making a comment on how in issues of social justice, equity, diversity, there's these segregations of Indigenous matters, international student matters,
Yes.
and then disability and diversity matters.
Yes.
And I would really like to see statistics that talk about how many international students, Indigenous students, and disabled students on the same chart.
Yes.
And I think that it's a really important thing. And then also, when we're talking about Indigenous education, often we're talking about it K through 12, and not really talking about the university situation. So this isn't really a question.
It's a great comment. Thank you, you're right. We're up against these, again, multiple challenges. So a lot of the large agencies that have the resources to collect and share this information, do the data collecting, and so we don't often have access to the raw data. All of these tables and things are generated by those. So for instance, with the international students, you're right, one of the really important things is really understanding how much of that is around class mobility. And so when we have people from international environments who are able to move internationally, I should say, to other places for their higher education or K-12 education, would understanding the place of class in those social class and economic mobility, what more complex and important information would that reveal for us? Yeah, you're absolutely right. The one sort of public service space, which was gutted, the Statistics Canada, was doing a lot more of that intersectional sort of data presentation on their websites. It's often hard to find and clunky to use, but it was there so that they would have sort of discrete by race and citizenship and language, but they would also do more intersectional analyses, presentations like rural and urban environments to help get at some sort of class-based issues, but also other ways in which intersectional, like I know gender and income, they would offer sort of more of the kinds of complex pieces that you're referring to. But yeah, obviously it's much more reflective of us. We don't just walk around in one-dimensional identities, and neither do our students. I don't know if the microphone, where it went.
Hi.
Here. Hello.
Hi, I'm Rabia. I'm a graduate student in the department. So I'll give you a bit of context of my question. My question's coming from, I think, the cyclical exhaustion that we all feel at different points in our life of, we're going to kill the planet and everyone in it, so the end. So I'm definitely feeling that. And I've also experienced teaching that one, being a TA in a course which was led by a racialized woman, right? Of social justice and education. And of course, her presence makes it all a bigger agenda than, like, it's never perceived as agenda-less just because the instructor and the assistant to the instructor are racialized or have an accent or anything like that. Like, social justice education cannot be neutral if taught by certain identities. And I've really kind of stepped back and and you put it up as well, I just don't know how to provide skills or practices or frameworks which really make ourselves, the practitioners, as well as our students, be very conscious of, as Audre Lorde put it, the oppressor within us. I feel like so much of this is trying to identify what's wrong out there. But I mean, it's like, to me, it's like just sitting here, I can also list all the, like, how much I benefit from all the things I'm critiquing. So I'm like really grappling with, like, one, seeing the struggle of practitioners in classrooms trying to be like, can you please for once think like with your heart, which sounds really weird, but Sam's my teacher, so I blame him. But then also coming back to, can we get anywhere if there is no internal reflective accountability? Because I'm exhausted by critique, but there's no auto-critique. Can you resolve life for me, please? Thank you.
Just like 2 minutes? Yes. There's definitely, I hear the battle fatigue and burnout, and Audre Lorde included, many scholars of color, women of color who've written about doing social justice work, have written about the importance of self-care. So I hope for those of you who are experiencing that kind of feeling, that you have a release valve. You're not like Lucy and Ethel on the chocolate runway, right? That you have a release valve of some sort that allows you to step back and sort of recharge your batteries around it. I feel like this sort of comes back to the internal work. Okay, so this might not be so popular, but here's what I'm going to say. Yes, internal work needs to happen for all of us because we all have a learning curve somewhere around some social issues. But for that work to be done effectively, I don't know if the classroom is the place to take that on, especially a class that meets once a week for 13 weeks for 2 hours or 1 hour, I don't know. The EDST classes used to be 3 times a week for an hour. I don't know if there's still that. On camp at SFU, our class meets for like 4 hours once a week, the diversity class, and it's not a required class either. So the folks who do a lot of diversity training and workplace training and extended, there are lots of these one-off events that they're asked to do, but the most effective, what I've heard them say around the sort of more effective diversity training work is that it happens long-term and it often happens in caucus groups. If anyone has seen the documentary, The Color of Fear, we have a really small group, so there's a skilled facilitator working with a group of 4 men, 2 white men, 2 men of color. Might be more than 4 men, there may be 6 men. Who's seen this film? It's been a long time. But the point I'm trying to make is that it's a small group with a skilled facilitator working in a sense along a caucus group. So an identity, so working on an aspect of identity, working on race in a place where other pieces are sort of moved away. So they've removed gender from the context in order to have those men think about, talk about, and have a facilitated conversation around race in order to make some of those internal that internal thinking and work happen. They spend 2 days just like locked up in the context of this documentary. It's a very intense period of time with a skilled facilitator who can take them through that internal work. And not everyone, I mean, there's sort of one guy who has this white man who has this sort of really intense awakening. But there's a cost to the other, especially the men of color in that conversation, for that one white guy to sort of have his moment of understanding about how his own privileges have shaped his life. There's a cost for the other men of color in the room. So I'm not saying that internal work doesn't need to happen and it can't be an effective place. What I'm saying is, I don't know that focusing on what I'm calling skill building or truth or the facts, that can't indirectly lead to sort of an understanding of how my own setting, privileges have led to the things that I take for granted, maybe some understanding about how I've come to be where I am. But doesn't depend on the rest of the room of 40 students, some students feeling targeted or having to endure, or as the instructor having to manage the racism of a few students or the sexism or homophobia of a few students, or to indirectly focus on one or the awakening of a few students at the expense of the rest of the students. I just feel like the structure of a university classroom space, sort of the space where I've been focusing a lot of the discussion, is best gotten at that way, through focusing on internal work. It may or may not be a strategy that works in all, I know it won't be a strategy that works in all settings, but I think that in a university setting with a limited amount of time, that there are ways in which that focus on skill building, analysis, information can help to challenge the purely presumed emotional piece. You're a woman, of course you think sexism is everywhere, right? You're a woman of color, of course you see racism everywhere. To sort of step away from that by presenting information. Here are statistics. Here's information that's collected. You, as an instructor in a classroom, in a district, working with families, you need to be aware of these dynamics, these demographics. There's these policies. You need to be aware of the School Act and what it means to make a space accessible. So these are the kinds of skill building things that don't require anyone to believe in whether or not spaces should be accessible or anti-racism work should happen. It's like, no, that's the law. You as a public school worker or as a university worker have these commitments that you have to uphold, and here are the skills that need to be developed. I don't think I've fixed the world, but thank you for the question. It's really important.
Thank you. Just really briefly, thank you so much for an excellent presentation. It's really timely in all sorts of ways. The idea of this, I mean, I think, that just building on Sam's question and some of the things you've said, I think it's so powerful to think about skills as dispositions also. Maybe it's the word skills that, some of us, or one of us, or the whole room finds problematic. So this notion of dispositions is I think really interesting. And it's interesting to me it's not just because I'm a historian that I think about, building in thinking historically about some of these.
Sure.
Is also another excellent, I think it dovetails really nicely with the approach you're trying to explore around these dispositions to not assume, to, as that you call skills. So I just wanted to sort of see about if history makes its way, I'm sure it does, into your work.
Absolutely. I think one of the key central pieces of history that I get at when we do the name activity and the individual and social group memberships simultaneously, history shapes our identities whether we intend for them to or not, just because of for many reasons, but just the linguistic and cultural and geographical, all of those things that I mentioned. So I couldn't have said 100 years ago that I was born in Turkey. It didn't exist. Right? So there are lots of ways in which the historical understanding can get at the context of truth, or the social context, the political context that we're responding to or needing to respond to today. I'm not ready to give up on the word skills, although I'm very happy to add dispositions to my list, because I do, and I could explore words other than skills, because I know that, skills and training and all of that has baggage too, so I hear that. But I think that it's the dispositional pieces, so don't assume, yes, but there's also action pieces that are connected to. So you can learn to, for instance, move where you're standing, just as a really simple activity or skill, to pull the attention of everyone in the room in a particular direction. So a skill that we sometimes use in faculty meetings with other sort of social justice-minded colleagues. Oftentimes, and it might not happen here, but it happens in a lot of places, women and women of color, when they start speaking, people get up and move around, and everyone's sort of, busy with other stuff, checking their email. And one of the things we'll sometimes do is try to lock eyes with someone and move their eyes to the speaker, right? It's a skill to put your attention here. Let's put our attention on the speaker. That kind of thing is, I think, skill development, and maybe it could be called something else that doesn't have as much baggage, or it has a different, it sort of recalls different things. But those are the kinds of things that I think of including, and really simple things a lot of us do, like speaking in, small group talkers, talking to your neighbor, or things that are very practical, practice-oriented skill building, I think can be valuable. So those are the pieces that I mean.
I guess we're all kind of caught up in the word skill because there is so much baggage around it and so much critique. But what I kind of following on from what you're saying, and maybe that before skill comes repeated practice. And I think what's important in that skill is this idea that when you think about the basketball player of Michael Jordan, it's not just his disposition or his love of the game, it's his commitment to practice. And I think there's something in the word skill that, you're a skilled violinist because you've actually practiced and repeated this action. And so within that, and so I guess in favor of your use of skill in some ways, is this idea that this isn't just magic, and the more you do something, the easier it becomes, right? And the better you get at it. But at the same time, you can have someone, if I think back in my own teaching and teacher education, of people going through the ropes, and they can kind of repeat behaviors, but if there's no, and I guess that comes back to Rabia's last reflection question, if there's no kind of internal reflection, do we actually master this way of being? Can it get us to that level of actually really fundamentally shifting our perspective and shifting our practice? So, but I did like also what you said around, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter in some senses, because teachers are going out into the classroom and they need to, even if they don't believe this, they need to actually change their practice. And so kind of this repeated practice, but yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Practice definitely in terms of, so Michael Jordan, it's a good reminder to sort of return to to see if that analogy continues to work. He doesn't rest on whatever skill development he's done. It's ongoing practice and drills, and maybe our self-reflections can also be enhanced by sort of collegial sort of feedback. One of the things that many of us rely on is that sort of not just checking in, but someone sort of checking in with you and like, hey, can I talk to you about what happened in the meeting today? And being able to sort of practice giving feedback to one another to improve, to not just rely on my own sort of internal analysis about what happened, but also be able to depend on whether it's one or two people in wherever my environment is where I'm doing this work, and say, and and trust in their reading of what else may have been happening in the room that I maybe didn't even realize was going on. Thank you. These are all really important and really good questions that I'll continue to think about. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Would like to